A second lens that we could consider will have to do with the formative years. So if you think about how early life has shaped the way you behave as an adult. Now, there are a number of features here that we need to consider. So in this little mini segment, I'm going to bring together multiple streams of research from multiple sources to help you understand how significant and important the early formative years between ages 0 to 6 to 10, depending on the research authors that you read. So I wonder how many of you have ever held a 2-day-old infant in your arms. And if you looked into their eyes, what did you see? Many people will say innocence, possibilities, the future of the world, a blank slate. The truth is, at 2 days, children can't even track your hand. Literally, the physiological connections between neurons in the brain and the neurons in the eyes have not yet formed, and so they really can't see very much at all. At birth, the human brain is growing at the rate of 250,000 neurons per minute. It's an explosive growth rate. In fact, in the first year of human life, 90% of the energy consumed in the infant's body is going into its brain. And this brain is continually growing and growing and reproducing to the point where we all get about 100 billion brain cells. And each of those cells has the capacity to connect with some 10,000 other neurons through synapses or synaptic connections. So the total number of connections, somewhere around 1 quadrillion synaptic connections. It's an extraordinarily complex organ. Now, as these neurons, which enjoy or they naturally tend to fire, they make a little blip and they send an electrical impulse to the next neuron through these synaptic connections. The connections that are used more frequently become stronger, patterned, shall we say. And the ones that are not used tend not to develop, not to grow, much in the way you could think about growing a plant in the garden. If you water it and use it and take care of it and fertilize it, it gets the proper sunlight, then it will grow. And if it's ignored and neglected and not paid attention to, it tends not to grow. So hence we learn to speak English or Spanish or Russian or Arabic or whatever your native tongue might be. We learn to use one hand, not the other hand, and we begin to develop patterns in these neural pathways that are developing in the course of our brains. But at birth, this child has inherited one of 2 key gifts, or shall we call them legacies. The first one is a set of genes. Now, I wonder what you think genes determine. How much of human behavior, in your estimation, is determined by our genetic gift, our endowment from our parental strain? We live in a very exciting time where we have mapped the human genome for the first time. We know what they are. We don't know what they all do. There are fewer genes than we thought there would be. Maybe we thought 100,000, seems to be around 35,000, 40,000 of them. And the connections between them and how they interact with each other, we're still discovering day by day what they do. So if you think about this newborn infant, it has already received this first major gift, a set of genes, and we're learning day by day what each of these genes do. So in this case, I remember exactly the day they discovered the D2 allele. This was very important to me because the D2 allele, they said, it's a gene and it's highly correlated with addictive behavior. This was interesting to me because my father was an alcoholic, my grandfather was an alcoholic, and my great-grandfather was an alcoholic. So what are the odds, high, medium, or low, that I have this D2 allele? obviously it's high. So now the question remains, as a child, none of us are thinking about this, but nevertheless, the existential question remains, given this gift of a set of genes, what, if anything, are we going to do with it? Now, in our brain, we have as many as 300 different hormones floating around that we've identified. So serotonin and epinephrine and norepinephrine and 300 of these. If you get a little bit too much of one and a little bit too little of another, you might end up with a profile like attention deficit disorder, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or bipolar disorder, what we used to call manic depression, or obsessive compulsive disorder. So I wonder how many of you know someone, have friends or associates who have a little bit of ADD, a little bit of ADHD or bipolar disorder, a little bit of obsessiveness. These aren't necessarily binary, they're an analog, so you could have a little bit, a moderate amount, or an extreme amount of each of these profiles. We call them disorders, I think, since they occur naturally and are based on our brain chemistry, that we might just simply call them profiles because they occur in nature and they occur frequently in nature in varying degrees in varying locations. So if you have a little bit of one of these, or you know people who have a little bit of this, or you have subordinates or associates who have a little bit of attention deficit or hyperactivity or bipolar, do you understand where that comes from? Do you understand how to manage it? Do you understand how to deal with it? And what if you have a little bit of it yourself? Do you understand how to manage that so you can turn it to your advantage as opposed to your disadvantage? If someone were born with, say, schizophrenia, which is partially genetically based, would you be able to manage that in yourself? It's probably on the severe end of these profiles and therefore more difficult to manage. But the issue is, whatever little bit of something you may have or you observe in people around you, if you're ignoring the genetic tendencies that we have based on our gifted brain chemistry, then you won't be able to manage those people effectively or appropriately given who they are. You might tell them to do something differently and not realize that it's not really something that they have that much control over. Which brings us back to the question, can you manage your own profile, whatever it was and whatever the profile was that you happened to inherit? So in my case, I mentioned to you this D2 allele here. The question is, given that I've got this alcoholic gene, what am I going to do about it? Now, at the same time, as soon as we're born, we begin to receive a second gift, which is a set of values, assumptions, beliefs, and expectations about the way the world is or should be. These are lessons that are taught to us by our parents. Now, Richard Dawkins calls them memes. These are, in his description, intangible packets of information that are handed down from generation to generation, whereas genes are tangible packets of information. We can literally see them under a microscope and understand what they look like and observe them, whereas memes or VABEs are not visible. They are stored somewhere in the brain in ways that we don't quite yet understand. Now, these VABEs begin to develop when a child is addressing some significant key questions. Now, these questions are not thoughtful. They're not thinking about these questions. They experience them. So a child is perhaps cold, it's aware that it's uncomfortable, it may be crying, And the question then that's related to that is, when I'm cold, will I be made warm? And when I'm hungry, will I be fed? When I'm wet, will I be changed? And when I'm alone and afraid, will I be comforted and loved? And again, the child is too young to actually be thinking this. We really don't even have memory until we're approximately 3.5, or 4 years old. So much of this is taking place before we even have the capacity of formulating thoughts. Again, you can imagine our brain cells are connecting. When we have experiences, the brain responds to that, and some connections get reinforced, other connections are not reinforced, and the child begins gradually to become aware, or semi-consciously aware, that it is either made warm, it's fed, it's comforted, it's changed when the need arises, or not. And these 4 fundamental questions, if a child gets sufficient answers, it may grow up with a whole personality. So if the child gets insufficient answers to these questions, it may grow up with holes in its personality. So let me explain to you what I mean by holes in your personality. I'm sitting in my office several years ago. The door's open. A woman sticks her head in and says, "Can we talk?" I said, "Okay." I didn't know who she was. She came in, sat down, closed the door, not a good sign, sat down in the chair and began to sob, not a good sign. I said, "What's the matter?" She said, "Well, I've just got the job I've always wanted, making more money than I ever thought I would make, working for the company I've always wanted to work for." I'm going, "This sounds really good to me. What's the problem?" She said, "Well, I called my mother to explain this to her. My mother," she said, "is active in the society circles of our home city. She's a member of the garden club. She's frequently volunteering at the hospital. She's quoted on television and radio and in the newspapers. And I called her to tell her about my success, and within 15 seconds, she said, sob, 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 she had turned the conversation from me to her. Wasn't I happy for her that she was going to be on television that weekend? Wasn't I happy for her that she had been quoted in the newspaper?" And then this student sitting in my office said, sob, 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 "It's been that way my whole life." Time out. What am I supposed to say? What would you say? Well, I'm thinking, given my reading and research on these early childhood developmental years, that when her mother was a small child, she probably got insufficient answers to these 4 basic questions. And therefore, she grew up with holes in her personality, so that when she married and had this child, later to become this student sitting in my office, one wonders how she parented. And the basic focus likely was on herself rather than on her child. So how would this have played out? We could imagine her parenting by saying things like, "If you would toilet train sooner, then I wouldn't have to deal with this mess. If you loved me, you wouldn't interrupt me while I'm talking on the phone. If you cared about me, you would clean up after yourself, do your own dishes, make your own bed, wash your own clothes." So the specifics of the language would be secondary, but the consistent tone would be focus on the child taking care of the mother's needs rather than the mother taking care of the child's needs. So here is a 30-year-old woman sitting in my office. Is a 30-year-old an adult? What's your view? Yes, no? 30-year-old woman at the pinnacle of her professional success to date, and she's reduced to tears, sobbing in a stranger's office, talking about her early childhood and how her mother raised her. Well, you can imagine the difficulty of helping this person in a short period of time understand how these early childhood events have shaped her need at age 30, when she gets success, to immediately think about calling her mother, looking one more time for some kind of recognition or acknowledgement or confirmation, and getting one more time, it's not about you, kiddo, it's all about me. So of course the danger is that this child is going to continue this generation after generation after generation. So if this student marries, has children, the danger is that because that's what she knows, she will continue this pattern year after year after year. So in the work of Bill Glasser, there are some common assumptions that every parent in the world share. So when you think about parents in New Guinea or Australia or China or Japan or South America or Africa, would you think that there were common assumptions worldwide? We'll talk some more about that later on. But for the moment, the answer is, well, there are. And if you think about them, it's pretty obvious. The first one is, I know what's right for you. What parent does not believe that assumption? The infant is helpless. I know what they should and should not do when they grow up and what makes good children and bad children and good adults and bad adults. I know what's right for you. The second one is, I have a right, perhaps even a sacred responsibility, to tell you what's right for you. And that's my job as a parent. That's what I'm supposed to do. And some would even argue that God or some higher force has commanded me or given me a stewardship and a requirement to teach you what's right for you. And the third assumption is, I have a right, perhaps even a responsibility, perhaps even a sacred responsibility, to punish you if you don't do what's right for you. So if you think about these three assumptions worldwide, in the sense that parents are saying, I know what you need to know, and right now you don't know that, so over the course of your early developmental years, again, psychologists vary between 0 to 6 and 0 to 10, when these basic conclusions are gelled in a person's mind. Do I have a place in the world? Do people care about me? Is it safe? Is it not safe? Do I have to care for myself? And all of these related questions to those four basic issues. If those assumptions, and they seem to be worldwide, humanly universal, then at some point, in order to become an adult, an individual must cross over a bridge to, I know what's right for me, not that someone else does. Now, many people, when they age and either become parents or become managers or leaders in organizations, simply go to the other side of the fence and promulgate those same three VABEs, or assumptions, if you will, without doing it consciously. So I'm working with a client in South Africa, for example. The individual comes up to me and says, I'm frustrated by my boss. I'm in an operational job and I want to move into a marketing job. And I keep trying to do that, and my boss finally stopped me in the hallway one day and said, I want you to stop trying to get into marketing. I have other plans in mind for you. So he's coming to me as a stranger from a different continent, telling me the story, asking what do I do, because the boss is behaving as if he knows what's right for this individual and isn't even conferring with or asking the individual what they want to do. So, like many parents, his boss was continuing with the unexamined assumption, I know what's right for you, I have a right to tell you what's right for you, and if you don't do what I tell you is right for you, I have a right, responsibility even, to punish you. So these three assumptions tend to be critical in helping us to understand why we might have certain patterns as adults, like this 30-year-old woman in my office asking to call her mother. So in my case, I grew up in a home, I mentioned, had alcoholism in it, but also some abuse. And I observed and experienced some of the cruelty that can go along with abusive family relationships. So then the issue becomes, well, what am I going to do with that, if anything? Am I going to perpetuate that pattern? I've got two big questions. Am I going to perpetuate this pattern that I learned as a child? Am I going to perpetuate the pattern that was endowed on me by my genetic gift? Or will I figure out a way that I might transcend or rise above these two gifts that I've been given as a child? In other words, I think people only become adults when they get to the point in life where they can decide what they want to keep, what they want to lose, and what they want to add to their repertoire of behavior. If you can't choose based on self-awareness, which goes back to our previous lens, if you can't choose what you want to do, how you want to think, and what you believe as an adult, rather than simply accepting the two gifts that you were given when you were small and defenseless and unable to reason as a child, then I would say you've never really become an adult. You've only become a viral shell that is perpetuating this material that was given to you, much like a virus. So this concept from Csikszentmihalyi of becoming a transcender, of learning to rise above one's inheritance, is an important element in becoming a fully functioning adult. We could think about behavior then as having three strata. We can identify the genetic strata that we could call hardware. It's our hardwiring based on physiological genes that we've received from our parents. We could talk about that early formative years as a kind of firmware. It is physiologically embedded in our brain, in our patterns of behavior, based on our early childhood experiences. And then we could also point to this third layer of what we might call the adult neocortical software, where we have conscious thought and intention, and we might decide what we want to do with our genetics and our firmware. So I mentioned Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. In a wonderful book, The Evolving Self, he raises a question that I think is the number one question in life. The number one question in life. And that is, will you ever become anything more than a vessel transmitting the genes and the VABEs of previous generations on to the next? In other words, without thinking reflectively about the lessons that you were taught, the genetic tendencies that you inherited, you will be, throughout your life, simply replicating the experience and the point of view and the judgments and the behaviors of previous generations. So the challenge, I think, is when you're no longer a defenseless child, can you become a person who can choose consciously the behavioral patterns, the assumptions, the beliefs, the thought patterns that you want to keep, those that you want to lose, and those that you want to add to your repertoire?